Kiev, the capital of modern Ukraine, is one of the oldest cities in Europe, having a long and colorful history dating back to the Middle Ages and beyond. According to medieval legend, it was dubbed the Mother of Rus cities. It is often regarded as the oldest city in East Slavdom, and some claim its origins stretch all the way back to the mammoth-hunting camps some 22,000 years before the birth of Christ. It shouldn't come as a surprise, owing to the geographical situation of Kiev, which truly lends itself to becoming the pivot of an early civilization. Most apparent when looking at a map would be its placement on the river Dnieper. Modern Kiev is of course many times larger than any ancient settlement. The city has since expanded and absorbed what were once satellite settlements and neighboring towns, but the ancient Kiev encompassed a much smaller area, restricted to the right riverbank. The river Dnieper has become the main artery of any civilization centered in the region. Most immediate would be the steady supply of fresh water for drinking, agriculture and cleaning, especially the sauna, which was regarded as a sort of national symbol in medieval Rus. The river also allowed for rapid travel across the country, even if you only had a raft or dugout canoe. Kiev is situated close to several of the Dnieper's large tributaries, the Pripyat and the Desna, effectively connecting these deep inland regions, otherwise difficult to reach in a time without roads. The Dnieper goes far into what is now modern Russia, and by portage one can reach the river Daugava, flowing into the Baltic Sea. On the other hand, one can travel south on the Dnieper and reach the Black Sea, from whence there was only a 48-hour trip to Constantinople. These interoceanic connections essentially allowed for an early form of global commerce. Much of Kiev's advantage is hidden beneath the green grass of the map, within the very soil itself. It is a black or dark grey mixture of plant roots decayed by the activities of intense bacteria, blended into a nutritious cocktail with a base of loess. It is befittingly known as Chernozem, meaning black earth, and Kiev marks the border of these fertile soils to the south, and the less favourable podzolic soil to the north. However, the fertility of Chernozem is often reduced by common droughts, making agricultural efforts high risk, high reward. Another one of the risks in living on the steppe and forested steppe zone was being a neighbor to the various nomads. Anyone living in Kiev was susceptible to sudden attack from the Scythians, Sarmatians, Huns, Avars, Magyars, Khazars, Pechenegs, and finally the Mongols, who destroyed the medieval city in 1240. However, Kiev wasn't simply situated on a flat ground for the nomads to stampede, but had some defensive advantages. One is of course the Dnieper itself. It separates the city from the east and the coming of the nomads. A nearby tributary of the Dnieper, the Podil, could be used as a convenient harbour. Reinforcements and supplies could arrive by water, and people could also use the river to escape. The terrain is marked by a plateau standing 100 meters above the Dnieper, and consisting of several hills. Of special importance are the Starokivska, Old Kiev, the Zamkova, the Castle, and the Shekovitsa. These hills could easily be fortified into defensible positions, but in ancient times there wasn't really any permanent settlement. Instead, the inhabitants moved between the different hills quite often. It wasn't truly until the arrival of the Rus that Kiev became the permanent settlement as we know it. The hills were separated by numerous ravines and little brooks, turning them almost into tiny islands, highly defensible, but making unification into a single settlement difficult. Below the hills and running along the waterfront is the Podil district. In ancient times, Podil was a low-lying riverbank, up to 13 meters below its current level, and placed underwater for most parts of the year. Thankfully, we no longer have to worry about horse nomads riding in and destroying our cool stuff. Unfortunately, those muscular steppe shads have been replaced by desperate telephone salesmen and sweaty nerds in their basement. Instead of plundering your farm and stealing your women, they will do something even worse: hack your bank account and snatch your cute cat pictures. Fortunately, the sponsor of today's video rise to the rescue. Ora is back, baby. You can't just secure yourself on a fortified hill anymore. Data brokers are able to sell your private information to undesirable groups. If someone is doing this, Ora is automatically able to tell them "nuh-uh" and opt you out. Aside from this, Ora offers a slew of other services: password manager, antivirus protection, VPN, and home title monitoring. All very necessary and helpful services in the online world. I'm able to offer you a 14-day free trial by using my referral link, aura.com/Baltic Empire, found on screen, in the video description, or pinned comment below. Try the service out and see how you like it. I'd also suggest taking a look at existing reviews of Aura, so you know what to expect. Good luck out there. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. Back to Kiev. Owing to these favorable conditions, Kiev has seen an almost uninterrupted chain of farming settlements since as far back as the Bronze Age. Before then, evidence points to hunter-gatherers roaming in the area, no doubt fishing in the Dnieper, hunting game upon the steppe, and collecting berries in the oak forests which flourished in the ancient vicinity. But the earliest settlement can be dated to the 6th millennium BC and has been attributed to what archaeologists call the Tripolia culture. It is in fact named after a site nowadays absorbed into Greater Kiev. However, the Tripolia culture stretched as far as modern Romania. This culture sustained itself on agriculture and domesticated animals, and is primarily known for its decorated and painted pottery. Clay female figurines are especially common finds, leading some to speculate that they were a matriarchal society. They were likewise early metal workers, making tools out of pure copper and eventually bronze. It is believed that the Tripolia culture disintegrated thanks to climate change, shrinking temperatures and rainfall, resulting in the shrinking of food production. Competition over resources led to a sharpened sense of group identity and the maintenance of their boundaries. This led to social hierarchization and the emergence of group-oriented chiefdoms, controlled by powerful men. This can be signified by the appearance of burial mounds, which could also be interpreted as territorial markers and symbols of regional power. Owing to their propensity of digging these pit graves, the succeeding culture is often called the pit culture. More commonly, the Yamnaya culture. Being more nomadic than the previous Tripolia, they are noted for the use of wheeled carts, and an economy based on stock breeding, cattle, sheep and goat, and horses. The pit culture was in turn replaced by the very similar catacomb culture in the 2nd millennium BC. The next millennium marked an age of change, an unstable climate, and the advent of ironwork. It saw the expansion of a social elite fighting from horseback and burying their royal dead in extravagant inhumations. Most impressive is perhaps their construction of hill forts as princely residences. The region around Kiev was ruled by the nomadic Scythians, and what is now the city itself seems to have been inhabited by a particular subgroup, referred to by the Greek traveller and historian Herodotus as the agricultural Scythians. Herodotus likewise made the first written mention of the international trade network running along the Dnieper, known to the ancients as the river Borysthenes. He described it as follows: "The Delians say that offerings wrapped in straw are brought from the Hyperboreans to Scythia. When these have passed Scythia, each nation in turn receives them from its neighbors until they are carried to the Adriatic Sea, which is the most westerly limit of their journey. From there, they are brought on to the south, the people of Dodona being the first Greeks to receive them. From Dodona they come down to the Melian Gulf, and are carried across to Euboea, and one city sends them on to another." Hyperborea referred to the unexplored northern reaches far beyond Scythia, the lands inhabited by northern Proto-Slavs, Balts, Finns and Norsemen. These offerings would have included fine pelts, and especially amber, which has been found as far south as Egypt. Traders at ancient Kiev most likely received Greek products. In a nearby grave was found a helmet of stereotypical Greek design. The trade contacts peaked with the rise of Rome in the 3rd century, coinciding with the rise of the Sarobinsi culture in the area around Kiev. They seem to have been a development of the agricultural Scythians, as nomadic influence can still be detected in their aesthetics. What distinguished them from earlier groups is their use of the plough in agriculture, and the importance of marsh iron in the metalworking economy. As aforementioned, they also had intensive trade contacts with Rome. Roman coins are an especially common find in the Podil district, the oldest dating back between 150 to 200 years before Christ, and bearing the name of the Roman consul, Spurius Afanius. Findings of coins are so numerous at Podil that some believe it had been the site of an ancient trade post, possibly controlled by the Romans themselves. It is often argued that this was the site of the mysterious settlement known as Azagarium, described by the geographer Ptolemy as located midstream up the Borysthenes, but some argue that Azagarium was located at Chernobyl. Other trade artifacts discovered at Kiev include items from the Celtic Latin culture, such as fibulae, ceramics and bracelets. However, others have argued that Podil was a low-lying riverbank until the end of the 9th century, and that it would have been unsuitable for a settlement in the ancient times up until then. The findings of Roman coins and other artifacts have been explained as possibly being carried there from the hills above, or even washed up by the river from settlements upstream. According to a legend told in the primary chronicle, it was during this time period that St. Andrew the Apostle visited the site that would become Kiev. He pointed at the hills above Podil and said, "God's mercy shall shine upon those heights. There shall stand a great city, and there he shall erect many churches." He then wandered up each of the hills, blessed them, and planted a cross. Then he left. The veracity of the story can of course be questioned. Eusebius mentioned in the 4th century that St. Andrew preached in Scythia. Perhaps the author of the primary chronicle had access to additional information which we no longer have. Or perhaps he made up the story to legitimize the existence of his country and patron city. Either way, St. Andrew is nowadays a patron saint in Romania, Ukraine and Russia. Between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Sarobince culture was supplanted by the Chernyachiv, who maintained their intensive contacts with the Roman world. Trade contacts reached their peak in the 4th century, with imported goods including oil, wine, burnished wares, and precious stones. Traditionally, the inhabitants of ancient Kiev had a tendency of moving between the different hills depending on their agricultural needs, but the Chernyachiv began a tradition of constructing a compact settlement on Zamkova and a cemetery at Starokivska. The exact identity of the Chernyachiv hasn't been identified, whether Proto-Slavic, Sarmatian or Gitai Dacian. This was further complicated by the arrival of the Germanic Goths in the mid-4th century. These invaders carved out a new kingdom, and were said by the Gothic Roman historian Jordanes to have ruled over all Scythia. Their involvement in Kiev isn't certain, but the Dnieper would have proven a valuable means of communication and raiding. The Goths were finally supplanted by the invading Huns in the early 5th century, and the survivors either driven out or assimilated into the local population. A small Gothic contingent would linger on in the Crimean Peninsula. For a brief spell, the early Kievans seem to have prospered. The hill fort at Zamkova seems to have been active in the 5th and early 6th centuries, and trade contacts were seemingly established with Byzantium, as indicated by findings of Byzantine coins dedicated to Emperors Anastasius and Justinian. The settlement at Zamkova expanded onto the other hills, including the Starokivska. Here we found the remnants of buildings and a stove filled with ceramic vessels. However, peace wasn't to last. In 560, the nomadic Avars ravaged their way westward, destroying anything in their path. In the same time period, evidence points to the Zamkova-based settlement being burned. The settlement was shortly after restored, and now centered around Starokivska. This settlement was protected by a wooden palisade and a ditch at least 3 meters deep. Inside of the protected area were found storage pits and dwellings, including a princely castle. In the middle of the settlement stood a pagan sacrificial site. It consisted of an oval figure, 4.2 meters long and 3.5 meters wide, with a rectangular outshoot in each direction. West of the figure stood a large pillar made of successive layers of clay, ash and charcoal, and surrounded by a number of animal bones and skulls. There were pottery ovens and ceramics, and especially fascinating is the find of a spinning wheel with a trident, believed to later have been adapted by the Rus. Nowadays it's a Ukrainian national symbol. The origins of the symbol has of course been disputed. The hill fort settlement, I guess we can call it Old Kiev, has traditionally been connected to the legend of the city's founding, as told in the primary chronicle. According to this story, 3 Slavic brothers and leaders of the Polianian tribe, Ki, Zhek and Koriv, established the city of Kiev together with their sister, Lubid. Each brother settles upon his own hill, and 2 of which are named after the brothers, Shekovitsa and Korevitsa. The primary chronicle claims that those who have no idea claim that Kiev was a ferryman. This indicates the existence of a local legend, perhaps of a ferryman establishing the town, signifying the ancient importance of maritime transportation. The writer of the primary chronicle rebukes this idea, claiming that Kiev was a powerful prince who visited Constantinople and was personally received by the emperor. On his way back home, he established a new city on the Danube, naming it Kievich. The veracity of this legend has, as you might have guessed, been disputed. On one hand, it has been claimed that Kiev did indeed exist, and was a powerful prince who ruled over the Polianian tribal union from the fortress of Kiev. This early settlement and the hypothetical tribal union has been compared to other Slavic proto-towns in Bohemia, Moravia and Bulgaria. As for the Polianians, they might have been the descendants of the Chernihiv culture. Others try to connect them to the even earlier Tripolia culture. The author of the primary chronicle claims that the name stems from the Slavic word pole, meaning field, which Ukraine holds a number of. This would be the same etymological meaning of the Polans, who established Poland, but the chronicle draws no connection between them. Indeed, there doesn't seem to be any mentions of the Polianian tribe outside of the chronicle. In this text it is last mentioned in the year 944. Some have argued that the Polianians were swift to adapt the identity of Rus. However, other tribes mentioned in the chronicle, like the Slovenes and Derevlians, do appear in other documents. Thus, the argument against the legend claims that the Polianians were entirely invented by the chronicle in order to provide a more cohesive and prestigious narrative behind the foundation of Kiev, its rise to prominence, thus legitimizing its power and rule over the lesser principalities. There could also be some relation between the Polianians and the Poliode, a Rus system of collecting tribute from their vassals. Polianians could then have just referred to the people which the Rus collected tribute from. The story itself of 3 brothers constructing a new home appears to be a biblical reference to the sons of Noah. This reference is even retold in the beginning of the chronicle, drawing a direct parallel to the biblical foundation of the world order and the city of Kiev. The story is likewise analogous to legends found in Armenia, in Croatia and Bulgaria, where 3 brothers and a sister, named after nearby geographical features, establish a settlement. Zhek was named after a nearby hill, Koriv after a biblical mountain, and the sister Lubid after a tributary of the Dnieper. What about Kiev himself? This name might stem from the Proto-Slavic word for a fence, or pole. Kiev would then essentially mean a place surrounded by poles, which makes a lot of sense for the palisaded hill fort discovered from the 6th century. Neither might the archaeology necessarily agree with the idea of a tribal union present within Kiev. Artifacts from the 7th century have been identified as belonging to 3 separate archaeological cultures, the Korchak, Penkovka and Zakhnivka. Perhaps Kiev functioned as a meeting place between these different cultures. Perhaps the Polianians were one of them and plundered from the other, or perhaps the settlement changed hands between these different groups. Something changed in the 8th century. The archaeological layer from this period is entirely empty, indicating a complete abandonment of the Kievan site between the Old Slavonic period and the arrival of the Rus. This was caused by a series of cataclysmic events which would persist into the 12th century. The hills became so heavily loaded that they eventually collapsed into landslides, continuously eroding onto the terrace of Podil. Between the beginning of the calamities and the arrival of the Rus in the late 9th century, the settlement seems to have been limited to the rather small hill fort at Starokivska, seemingly only 2 hectares in size. The population doesn't seem to have been higher than 200 people. Sometime before the arrival of the Rus, the Kiev settlement was made a tributary of the Khazars. This was described in the primary chronicle as occurring between the deaths of the founding brothers, and was compared to the Egyptians enslaving the Israelites. Just like this biblical dynamic, the chronicle says how the Rus would then also conquer the Khazars. Exterior sources, both written and archaeological, support a Khazarian presence. Findings of Eastern coins in the 8th century onwards indicates that the city was a partner in the wider Khazarian trade network. There are no Byzantine coins from this period, indicating that what remained of the settlement traded only with the Khazars. A Khazar community is in fact described in the primary chronicle as existing in Kiev, and in one of the districts was discovered a crafting mold with Arabic inscriptions, dating to the late 10th century, indicating the presence of Eastern immigrants in Kiev during this period. In the 10th century, Khazarian King Joseph wrote in a letter how he dominated 3 Slavic tribes, called the Ventit, Sever, and Slavion. Perhaps one of these inhabited Kiev or its surroundings. Ibn Fadlan said in 922 how the Khazars reigned over the Slavonic peoples, who humbly submitted to the Khazar king. Quite telling is the mid-10th century Byzantine document, the Administrando Imperio, which refers to Kiev as Sambatas, a name of seemingly Turkic or even Magyar origin. Some have even claimed a Khazar origin of the name Kiev. Judging by these sources, historians have gone so far as to speculate that the Khazars ruled over, inhabited, or even established the city of Kiev. So too has there been speculation on a Jewish presence or founding of Kiev. Judaism became an official religion of Khazaria in the early 7th century, and though the Jews never formed the majority of the population, they were nonetheless active in both trade and administration. Some sources and speculation even point to the conversion of the Kagan himself and his close followers. Evidence for a Jewish involvement in early Kiev is mostly centered around a Hebrew document from 930, nowadays creatively titled the Kievan Letter. In this letter, the Jewish community in Kiev asked for a sum of 40 coins in order to pay off the debts of one of their members who was recently robbed. It is in fact the earliest discovered document to mention Kiev by name, in the Hebrew form of Giob. I definitely did not pronounce that correctly, and the Mossad are currently tracking me for anti-Semitism. Anyway, the Jewish community in Kiev being unable to amass the ransom indicates that it wasn't especially large. Jewish merchants called Radhanites were of course active across Eastern Europe and beyond. This shouldn't come as a surprise, but it doesn't seem as if they established Kiev, and the rather limited settlement at Starokievska did not expand in any significant way under Khazarian control. Though the last 100 years or so had been rather sleepy for the young city of Kiev, the late 9th century would prove quite explosive. It would see the conquest of the city by the Rus, and its expansion into one of the largest settlements in the region, in less than 40 years. To say that a lot of crazy things happened is a bit of an understatement. According to the primary chronicle, the Rus, based out of Lake Ilmen and the city of Novgorod, organized a 200-ship attack on the city of Constantinople. On the way down the Dnieper, 2 boyars named Askold and Dia settled in Kiev, assembling a host of Varangians and taking over the city from the Khazars. In the year 882, a member of Rurik's clan, Oleg, assembled a war host and moved down to Kiev. He told Askold and Dia that he had come to trade and lured them down to his boats. He proclaimed that they were not princes, not even of princely birth, but that he was. Then he presented them Igor, son of Rurik, and then he slew them. Having killed Askold and Dia, Oleg made Kiev his capital and proclaimed her the mother of Rus cities. The statement stems from the word metropole, meaning mother city in Greek. The murder of the 2 rulers proved a major source of inspiration for 19th century artists and has seen a lot of renditions. Askold and Dia are 2 of the most mysterious figures in the history of Rus. Most historians agree that their names are Norse in origin, Höskuldur and Dyre, but some have presented Slavic alternatives. They are never referred to as Varangians in the primary chronicle. They are called boyars and said to be not of Rurik's people, at least in my translation. And people could refer to their ethnicity, but it could also refer to their family. They were unrelated to Rurik when compared to Oleg and Igor. Neither does this dynamic duo appear in any other written sources. An Arabic source from 940, named the Golden Meadows by Al-Masudi, lists 3 kingdoms of the Sakaliba, an Arabic catch-all term for northern Europeans: Adir, Alfirag, and Turk. Wow, the kingdom of Turk. Alfirag and Turk are believed to have been Bohemia and Hungary respectively, whereas Adir could have referred to the Kievan principality as being ruled by Dia or a member of his dynasty, or it means something entirely different. The existence of Askold and Dia can be debated upon, But it also seems far-fetched that the writer of the primary chronicle just invented them out of the blue. Certainly some sort of historical precedence must have inspired them, however far from the truth. What is known for a fact is that the Rus expanded southward in the late 9th century, and that they settled and expanded the settlement of Kiev into the medieval city. But neither of these events should be taken for granted or seen as a natural process. They were consequences of the circumstances. Allow me to explain. For one, the Rus had previously only been interested in the trade with the Caliphate, bringing precious Arabic silver through Khazaria by travel on the Volga River. The Volga was geographically and politically safe, whereas travel on the Dnieper was made difficult by the 9 rapids, which had to be traversed by portage, and the presence of hostile horse nomads, the Magyars. 2 events provoked the Rus' expansion southward. For one, the Magyars decided to migrate westward, eventually making war upon the Bulgars and carving out a new kingdom in the Carpathian Basin. Secondly, the flow of Arabic silver grounded to a halt. The reasons why have been speculated upon. Political disputes in Khazaria or the Caliphate, the slowing of mining operations, or even the Khazars blocking the trade of silver after the Rus' occupation of Kiev. It is a chicken Kiev or the egg kind of debate. Did Rus' occupation of Kiev lead to the Khazar blockage of silver, or did the blockage of silver lead to the Rus' occupation of Kiev? I'm personally more inclined towards the former. Most evidence points to the Khazars having a good relationship with the Rus during this period, most likely in the form of an alliance or even some sort of subservience. The Rus had a trade district in the Khazar capital of Atil, and served as mercenaries at the Khagan's court. The Rus borrowed heavily from Khazar culture, adapting their armor, weaponry, clothing, hairstyles, and titles. The Kievan princes were titled Khagan, even if formally, into the Middle Ages. Prince Sviatoslav of Rus wore his hair in the nomadic fashion, nowadays associated with the Cossacks. On Rus manuscripts, we never find their warriors wielding Frankish swords or Spangen helmets, but a pointy Khazar helmet, and wielding the curved saber. In the 9th century onwards, the Khazars were a powerful trade partner, while risked the ire of the Khagan by occupying one of his tributaries. Of course, the primary chronicle never describes any friendly relations between the Rus and Khazars, because by the time of the chronicle's writing, the Khazars were an enemy vanquished by the Rus. I think there are several possibilities as to how the Rus came to settle in Kiev. Firstly, we can take the chronicle at face value. The Rus conquered it. But why would the Rus and Khazars then continue as partners? Why would the Byzantines still refer to it by its Khazar name in the mid-10th century? And why was there still a Khazar community in Kiev during the same period? Secondly, Askold and Dia did conquer Kiev, but on a separate initiative from the Rus Khagan at Lake Ilmen. The chronicle makes it clear that they ruled the lands of the Polianians separately from Rurik in Novgorod. Perhaps the Rus Khagan was then tasked by the Khazars to reconquer the fortress, and was in turn allowed to keep it. This could mean that the Khazars did put a stop to the flow of silver due to the conquest of Kiev, as a sort of punishment for Rurik letting his subordinates run amok. It is a compromise between the different ideas. Lastly, the Rus made some sort of deal with the Khazars, allowing them to sell in Kiev and use it as a trade post. In return, the Rus would continue paying tribute, in addition to expanding the city with their ambitious plans. The truth likely lies somewhere between these different explanations. Then there were the geographical circumstances, which allowed for the settling and expansion of the Kiev settlement. As described previously, recurring landslides made the surrounding hills virtually uninhabitable, leaving the Starokivska hill with a small development potential. In the late 9th century, the landslides had finally begun to recede, soil eroding from the nearby hills onto the terrace, and the floodwaters carrying silt deposits led to a natural enlargement of the Podil district. In the course of the 10th to 12th centuries, the lowest point rose to a whopping 11 meters. As a comparison, it has only risen by 2 meters between then and today. By raising the terrace above the riverbank, it finally became suitable for settlement. Local trees were harvested. The area was forested with oak back then, and built into log-frame dwellings. Construction began at the latest in 887, in the reaches closest to Samkova Hill, and in 900 expanded onto the center of the terrace. The Pochina could be used as a natural harbor, easily accessible from the habitations at Podil, Areas suitable for settlement were divided into plots of a regular size. The smaller ones were 300 square meters, the larger ones 600. They were divided by fences in a similar system to the one deployed at Holmgard and Gnostava, indicating a Scandinavian influence. The plots consisted of a house stood back from the street, with several outbuildings along the street. The buildings were generally quite small, but often had a second story. Settlements grew constantly, and streets and alleys divided the area into blocks. The houses were built in a uniform fashion with next to no variation, and the architecture itself indicates the arrival of northern newcomers. The natives of the middle Dnieper were known to live in semi-subterranean pit dwellings. Remnants of these have been found on the hills around Podil, but not in the district itself, because of course the soft ground and flooding could not allow it. Instead, the new habitations were built with a log frame construction, typical of the style found in northern Rus settlements like Holmgard and Aldegiborg. These styles of buildings have been associated with the northern Slavs and Finno-Ugrians. They were generally quite small, but often had wooden foundations to elevate them above the surface, and even second stories. However, Middle Dnieper natives certainly lived in the Podil district since the 9th century expansion, since some of the earliest findings include hand-molded pottery of a style distinctive to that culture. Indeed, most of the inhabitants of Podil were craftsmen, and traders, and people working the waterfront. Byzantine coins point to trade contacts, and crafts included iron metallurgy, blacksmithing, jewelry, ceramics, carving of bone and stone, woodworking, and more. The earliest constructions can be dated to the 880s, which coincides with the Chronicle dating Oleg's conquest of the city to 882. Maybe the story was a dramatic and symbolic retelling of a more boring reality. But life in Podil was far from boring, but not in the way you might expect. The natural cataclysms hadn't stopped just yet. Landslides weren't as common as before. Instead, the people were haunted by semi-frequent flooding, forcing people to abandon their homes on the sort of regular, perhaps once every 5th to 10th year. Of course, you were more susceptible to flooding the closer down the waterfront you lived, but masses of snow accumulated on the hills and ravines would melt in springtime and stream into the lower district, bringing with it new sediment which destroyed looser buildings, buried shallow foundations beneath a new layer, and took what the inhabitants couldn't take with them into the river. The inhabitants could do nothing but run away, cope, return, and rebuild. And they did this again, and again. Evidence points to a single fence line being reconstructed up to 17 times. Each time they tried to align it with the trajectory of the flooding, and every time the flooding changed direction. Efforts were made to fight back against the flooding. The people constructed wooden cells, literally meant to realign the direction of the floods. These cells sometimes became part of structures and habitations, and resembled the wooden bases used for transporting cargo in shallow water, or even ships. The problem was that the stream frequently changed its course. I find the stubbornness of the inhabitants to be both inspiring and hilarious. The question is, of course, was it worth it? Ever since the Rus' attack on Byzantium in 860, they seem to have been interested in its riches. Kiev was a convenient springboard from which to organize expeditions, well defended against nomadic ambushes, and then continue to Constantinople. In 911, they signed a trade treaty with the Romans, allowing the flow of profitable commerce. And in spite of the natural disasters, the settlement of Kiev would expand rapidly. Within 40 years, it had grown to a size of 150 hectares, making it one of the largest sites in the region, and perhaps making it worthy of the title Mother of Rus Cities. By 930, an Arabic source mentions the city of Kuyaba as a seat of the king of the Rus, signifying it had become the capital. The Byzantine text, the Administrando Imperio, explains Kiev as the staging point for Rus trading expeditions to Byzantium, but says that the Prince of Rus still had his seat at Nemogardas, most likely Holmgard at Lake Ilmen. The population of Kiev seems to have grown from a few hundred to several thousands in the early 10th century alone, and as Podil became increasingly habitable, the settlement had expanded to an area of between 150 to 200 hectares at the end of it, making it one of the largest and fastest growing settlements in all of Rus. Starting around 900, the upper district on the hilltops was expanded in tandem with the growth of Podil. The expansion here was comparably limited, and relegated to the construction of cemeteries in the northern and southern hills, and dwellings for the upper class on the hills immediately surrounding Podil. Evidence points to the upper class fortifying and settling on several of the hills, on the Yurkovitcha to the west and on the Starokivska. The latter was fortified by digging a 4-meter deep moat and a 5-meter high earthen rampart, crowned with wooden fortifications. Behind them were constructed large wooden buildings, and possibly halls or imitations of Byzantine structures. 9 smaller houses were built on the northwestern and northeastern edges of the slope, and here and there could be found some pit dwellings too. This was most definitely the seat of the ruling aristocracy, the warrior retinue, patronized craftsmen, and foreign dignitaries. In the middle of the 10th century, the elite of Starokivska began building with stone. Stone constructions were impossible at Podil owing to the soft surface, and was one of the many marks of status in Kiev. Material had to be transported from a considerable distance, including heavy granite stones, sandstone and rosy slate from the quarries at Ovruch, 150 kilometers away. The first construction was most likely a palace, owing to its extravagance, which rivals anything found in Rus or the wider Viking world. It appears to have had a circular layout, with an outer diameter of 17 meters. The building was richly embellished with frescoes and marble decorations from Byzantium, and had a floor of polychrome tiles. It had a wooden upper floor, which seemingly collapsed from a fire. The second building stood about 13 meters from the later Tithes Church, and had a rectangular shape. It was 21 meters long and 10 meters wide, and partitioned into a large room and 2 smaller ones. Stone and brick constituted the base, with decorations of marble and slate. Frescoes adorned the walls, and there are signs of mosaics. Like the previous building, it also had a wooden upper floor. There are minor signs of other stone buildings, and there also seems to have been a pagan altar at the center of the hill. The stone structures had most likely been constructed by Byzantine architects. One might think that Byzantium was the premium trade partner, but findings of Byzantine coins are relatively minor when compared to those of Arabic dirhum, indicating that Kiev had trade connections with the Caliphate also, likely going down the Dnieper, into the Sea of Azov, up the River Don, and then portage to the Volga and into the Caspian Sea. Of course, the Byzantines were reluctant to export their currency, and evidence of extensive contact can be found through other items. Amphora are plenty. There seems to have been at least 4 different burial rites conducted at the surrounding cemeteries. There were cremations placed on the low barrows, often upon a clay bed according to local custom. Another native custom was the burial of urns in pits. The northern immigrants brought with them the traditions of inhumation and chamber burials. Several of these include Scandinavian-style artifacts. Scandinavian-style artifacts only appear in small amounts in the lower stratas of society, indicating that Norse immigrants did not constitute the majority of the first colonizers. Indeed, the graves found with Scandinavian items can only be chronologically dated to between 950 and 990. If it wasn't for the written evidence, which many consider dodgy, there wouldn't be any reason to believe that Norsemen played a substantial role in the settlement of Kiev in the early 10th century, and that they only started arriving in the mid to late. A lot of the graves have been destroyed by the erosion of the hills, plundering, excavations and construction work. This, combined with the frequent use of cremation, has made it hard to identify artifacts and especially DNA samples within the cemeteries, compared to other sites which I've discussed in previous videos. DNA samples from Kiev reveal a significant Danish and Norwegian contingent. Since the number of Norse artifacts discovered at Kiev is rather limited, I didn't find it necessary to include an in-depth discussion about them, especially since there isn't much of interest when compared to findings in the earlier videos. There would be a lot of repetition, so I will only include notes of special interest. Several findings, including this pin, indicates that local craftsmen imitated Scandinavian-style jewelry. In the late 10th century, the production of dice indicates connections to Danish jewelers working for Harald Bluetooth. There are signs of nomadic steppe influence among the warriors. Many of them have been buried with their horses, which of course seems to be an old Scandinavian practice predating Rus. However, much of their weaponry and armor seems to be of a nomadic character, including this saber. Remnants of the nose guard of a helmet have been found, seemingly of Scandinavian character. Very interesting is the early intrusion of Christianity into Kiev, predating the conversion of Rus in 988. This can be seen in 2 graves at the same site on Starokivska. One of them was the inhumation of a boy, his status attested to by 2 silver derhum made into a pendant. They can be dated to 911, so the boy might have been buried in the 910s or 920s. A cross had been carved into one of the pendants, and a silver mount in the form of a cross had been placed over his chest. The combination of the crosses with sacrificial animal parts hints at some sort of early conversion syncretism. In another nearby grave was found a woman buried in a coffin. She bore a necklace with plenty of beads, 1 derhum dated to the early 10th century, and 3 silver crosses. A tithe church would later be constructed upon these graves, indicating that it might previously have been a Christian cemetery. Other burials include cross pendants with rounded ends and a Latin, English design. And this is rather surprising considering the proximity to Orthodox Christianity, but it reflects an early relationship of Norse travelers to Western Christianity instead of the Eastern Church. Kiev would only continue to grow in the second half of the 10th century, when it expanded into the medieval center, which would persist into the 13th century. Podil and Starokivska continued their natural expansion in habitations and industries, and agricultural settlement also began on the outskirts. The fertile surroundings were farmed and grazed by cattle and horses. Since the Dnieper is connected by various tributaries to most of the reaches of modern Ukraine, the Kievans were able to trade with and collect tribute from their neighbors. Honey was processed into mead, and the northern migrants had brought with them the sauna. The primary chronicle describes how the Slavs would heat up and whip themselves with branches of birch, and then douse themselves in cold water. This national symbol could take a darker turn. According to legend, Princess Olga used an overheated sauna to kill several of her enemies. It is only natural that Kiev would continue expanding and become the capital of Rus, even though it was only settled relatively late. Most of the settlements of this nascent empire had been founded in defensible waterway harbors, with a focus on trade and handicrafts. Agriculture was largely neglected, and populations were low and development potential wasn't really considered. And that changed in the mid-10th century, when the Rus started switching the focus of their economy from international trade and handicrafts to agriculture, taxes, and the collection of tribute. Princess Olga created her pogosti, centers for the collection of tribute. The ideal city was easily accessible by water, the fastest means of travel, defensible and agriculturally self-sufficient. This means that a lot of the early Rus cities were abandoned in favor of more favorable locations. Gnostava was moved to Smolensk, Holmgard to Novgorod, and so on. A similar process occurred back in Scandinavia. And Kiev was an exception to this, qualifying both as an early trade center and as a defensible feudal estate, and with significant development potential, owing to the fertile farmlands and easily settled terrain upon the hills and increasingly more habitable Podil. The first wave of significant expansion is associated with Vladimir the Great, as explained in the primary chronicle. Archaeology points to the district of Starokivska being expanded to the size of a town. The number of habitations increased, and the stone structures became more impressive. The old burial mounds were destroyed in order to make space for urban development. Evidence points to a new pagan sanctuary being erected outside of the old fortifications. It was described in the primary chronicle as consisting of wooden idols of Perun, Kores, Dasbog, Stribog, Simargl, and Mokos. The idol of Perun had a silver head and golden mustache. However, Vladimir would not prove a patient pagan. After failing to centralize and reform the Slavic cult, he converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988. Some written evidence points to prior existence of churches at Kiev, but archaeology hasn't yet proved their existence. They might have been small chapels and built out of wood. Between 989 and 991, Byzantine architects constructed the first stone church at Kiev, the Church of the Virgin, placed upon an old cemetery, which, as aforementioned, included Christian graves. The church was far from Spartan, being constructed with reddish quartzite, alternating with layers of pinkish cement and brick. One of these bricks bore the trident sigil of Vladimir, nowadays recognized as a national symbol of Ukraine. The church was also called the Tithes Church, because Vladimir bestowed it with a tithe of his property. It was consecrated in 996, and the interior richly decorated with marble and mosaics. Facing the church but some distance away, to the southeast and west, were constructed two new palaces, built in a similar fashion to the church. One of them had a substructure made of concrete. The palaces were most likely surrounded by smaller houses, inhabited by Vladimir's closest followers. Two of the most radical shifts in the late 10th century developments was that Kiev was becoming less fragmentary. The separate districts were becoming more connected. Kiev of this period would have been an incredibly dynamic and multicultural melting pot. There were northern Slavic rulers, native Slavic inhabitants, Norse nobility, traders and mercenaries, Jewish Radhanite merchants, Khazar or even Arabic craftsmen and immigrants, and Greek artisans and architects. Slaves and servants attended their masters and worked the fields. Craftsmen included jewelers, glassblowers, blacksmiths and metalworkers of all kind. Artists here created icons, carved ivories and made frescoes. The craftsmen of Podil soon acquired a sort of self-government, and trade relations stretched all around the known world. The next wave of expansion began in 1037, under the oversight of Yaroslav the Wise. Using Constantinople as inspiration, he constructed a massive town of Yaroslav in the southwest of Starokivska and erected multiple churches. His most impressive project were the defensive works surrounding the entire city. The earthworks were up to 30 meters wide at the base and up to 11 meters high, and they were topped by a palisade which in places took the total height of 16 meters. 3 gate towers pierced the ramparts: the Jews' Gate in the southwest, the Poles' Gate in the southeast, and the masonry edifice of the Golden Gate at the southern tip. Not only did the fortifications protect Starokivska, but the lower district of Podil as well. This mega project would have required considerable effort. It is estimated that if 1,000 men worked 300 days per year, they would have needed 4 years to shift the requisite volume of earth. The most impressive of Yaroslav's churches was the Church of Saint Sophia, built and decorated between 1037 and 1047, on the southern road to the Golden Gate, and was the seat of the Kievan Metropolitan. Above the columns of the central nave, visitors could look up at the portraits of Yaroslav and his family. Byzantine inspiration could be seen in the central dome and rows of columns. The inside was decorated with mosaic images, including the Mother of God and a frieze of the Christ. There is some interesting graffiti inside of the church, one referring to Yaroslav as Tsar, another calling him Kagan. However, the prosperous district at Podil was continuously subjected to flooding throughout the 10th and 11th centuries. But the flooding stopped mysteriously in 1131, with the construction of the Church of the Virgin Pirogosha, perhaps as the result of divine intervention. Perhaps not exactly. By this point, the terrace had grown so much from the erosion and river sediment that it stood safely away from the floods of the Dnieper. Since the 12th century, the Podil terrace has only grown 2 meters, compared to the 12 meters between the 10th and 12th centuries. And even though the inhabitants of Podil would no longer have to worry about rebuilding their fences or going to school on a raft, Kiev had ironically begun to decline, partially owing to the reasons leading to its success. I mentioned how urban development in the 10th century led to the rise of militarily defensive and agriculturally self-sufficient cities in Rus. Well, the feudal lords seated in these towns were now able to take care of themselves and began drifting away from Kiev. As the princes of the mother city became less effective rulers, the once mighty empire stretching from Lake Ladoga to the shores of the Black Sea was now a fragmentary dominion of local warlords. Kiev was sacked in 1169, but managed to recover. In 1240 it was attacked and finally destroyed by the Mongols. Many of the inhabitants fled to Novgorod, the preeminent power of medieval Rus. However, Novgorod made no pretensions to the Kievan legacy. When Moscow rose to prominence in the 14th and 15th centuries, its princes would make claims to the Kievan legacy by referring to Muscovite lands as the Ruskaya Zemlya, land of the Rus. Moscow would eventually conquer the Rus principalities and form the country we now call Russia. The expansion of the Kievan Principality outside the boundaries of its capital has not been fully explored in this video, and will instead be covered in a future episode. I might also make a video on the Rurikid dynasty and if they actually existed as a coherent family. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It required considerable work since the first draft of the script was corrupted. I think the second draft is better, so it might have been a sign from God, but I think there were also some things I might have missed. Anyway, please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter to help the channel along. See ya!